welcome everybody to this interesting and what I think of as a fascinating topic this evening. We have a wonderful speaker, Michael Mehaffy. I'll talk a little bit more about Michael as we go along. My name is Phil Stafford, and I'm a retired anthropologist from Indiana University. And in retirement, working on a new initiative we call the Co-Design Commons. And that's an affiliation with Commons Planning Incorporated, based in Atlanta. And the proprietor is my good friend and colleague, Scott Ball, whom some of you may know. Here's our agenda this evening. I'm going to start with a brief introduction, talk a little bit about the kind of defining the problem and potential solutions. Then we'll turn it over to Michael for 30 to 40 minutes. We'll have some discussion, opportunity for questions and answers. And then we'll do a close, and Michael will do this, but I'll reiterate the potential value to you of a conference coming up next June in Carmel, Indiana, the International Making Cities Livable Conference. So I think one of the most important points that we can make about social isolation is that it's not equivalent to loneliness. Loneliness is defined as a subjective feeling. And it's certainly a problem in this country and globally now. Some countries have national programs addressing loneliness. The United Kingdom has such a thing. We're talking a lot about age tonight. And while we think of aging sometimes as a period of loneliness, it's more or less very old age that's a period of loneliness. And in fact, the rates of loneliness in youth are also high these days. And so those two populations in some ways are most vulnerable to loneliness. There are different types of loneliness. There's the existential loneliness that we all feel when we get philosophical about our place in the cosmos. There's emotional loneliness, which often occurs through grief associated with loss. And that's certainly characteristic of a lot of experiences of older people. And then social loneliness, which is loss of a sense of belongingness and a lack of sort of desired relationships. Loneliness does have some specific and significant problems associated with it: high blood pressure, heart disease, anxiety, cognitive decline, and et cetera. And that's especially true with chronic loneliness, not intermittent loneliness. So social isolation is predictive of loneliness, but not always. As you know, people can be lonely in a crowd. Loneliness is often defined as perceived social isolation. And just an old man sitting on a bench on a window, which I hope is not higher than the second floor, kind of looks lonely owing to our stereotypes, but may be actively engaged in the street life, but may have some issues with social isolation around his mobility and his ability to actually get down on the street. Unfortunately, loneliness is too often characterized as a medical problem, and our interventions around loneliness are medical in character. And I'm pleased that the field of medicine is oriented more towards a person-centered model of care, but this medical home model typically refers to the relationships among the clinical providers as the medical home. But the patient is still a patient in the traditional way. They are observed, assessed, diagnosed, and protocoled. And the focus is on the individual as in some ways isolated. But there are a number of things that contribute to feelings of loneliness that have nothing to do with medical problems: the socio-demographic issues, mobility, social participation, and the living environment in which people find themselves. And so I'm also pleased to see that the medical model these days is being influenced by the field of public health, and people are paying more and more attention to the social determinants of health and illness. And so the medical model is becoming more comprehensive in its desire to pay attention to some of these environmental factors. There's a change in some ways regarding the position of the patient, that we make a better attempt to acknowledge their own goals and values rather than our own clinical goals. Or in addition to our own clinical goals, the patient is seen less perhaps as an object and more as a subject, an agentive actor. And as I say, we're acknowledging some of the social determinants of health these days. However, interventions for social isolation may look very different from interventions for those who feel lonely. And that's really what we're attempting to address tonight. And so it's not only about loneliness, it's about access to information, access to products, services, food in particular. I think that's so important. Access to the arts, third places that Michael is going to be discussing, access to people, and access also to opportunities to share, to give, to contribute to civic life. And some of you have heard me refer to older people not as consumers, but as producers. And that's an important principle that should inform any planning that we do in our community. It is an issue, a big kind of a problem, really. 24% of community dwelling older adults are socially isolated, which is an objective member of their participation in society. And in fact, a large number of older people live alone. It's 28% and sometimes higher. And living alone is considered an at-risk state for social isolation. So that's a huge change, somewhat associated with changing household structures in this country and in others. There are some specific risk factors for social isolation that planners should know about. Some of them are personal and some of them are structural. Socio-demographic risk factors associated with persons might be that they are older or very old. They have lower education, lower income. They're unmarried, male, interestingly, non-Black and non-Hispanic, and reside in what is sometimes called individualistic cultures. And the U.S. is seen as one of those particular cultures. Personal characteristics of individuals, such as fear for safety, distrust of their neighbors, individual preferences. You know, some people prefer solitude, and that's a good thing. Feelings of stigma and shame in public, mobility limitations, cognitive and sensory limitations, which are very, very important to take into consideration. And then structural factors, just inadequate infrastructure in which people live, age segregation, cultural notions of who belongs where, pollution, air quality, crime, social inequities related to education and income, and changes in household structure. Those are some of the risk factors associated with depression. So what I think is worthwhile is considering changing the paradigm when we think about social isolation away from a kind of a medical, individually centered issue to a more complex understanding of people within society. The Ostroms, who are Indiana University faculty, both gone now, but you may know have heard of Lynn Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for economics, the first woman to do so, even though she was not an economist. She and her husband Vincent worked on what are called polycentric systems. And you can see this as a different understanding of the position of people within social groups. And in this particular example, you can see that 5 direct relationships lead to 10 additional ones. There are actually 225 potential connections within that group and 16 actual connections. And the relationship of those two is considered the density of a social network. Density is one factor, the frequency of interaction, the duration of interaction is another factor, describing our position within society. And these are all important issues that urban planners can pay attention to when they think about designing environments to support that. That's the raw material for planners, if you will. And if you take a look at the character of this relationships in society, you can see that there's significant social capital represented. And so that's not only an asset to individuals, but that's an asset to communities because it's an opportunity to accumulate wealth in the form of social capital, which is an important principle of a good community. It's not just about density, though, and quantitative interactions, it's about the meaning of relationships. And I'm going to end with this notion that a good old age is not about time and the body, but about place and the meaning of relationships. And that's a principle that certainly has guided my work and comes from my direct experience with older adults over the last 45 years. So I'm going to end my slideshow here and introduce Michael Mehaffy. It's such a pleasure. I've known Michael for several years since I started attending the International Making Cities Livable conference. Michael is the executive director of the International Making Cities Livable conference series, which will be running a conference in Carmel this coming June 8 to 12. He is also a researcher, educator, and author who has held appointments in architecture, planning, and philosophy at 7 graduate institutions in 6 countries. In addition to his academic career, he's also an active planner and designer with key roles in implementing more livable, human-centered neighborhoods and cities. He's author or co-author of over 30 scientific papers and over 20 books, including Cities Alive and A New Pattern Language for Growing Regions. He is also currently senior researcher at the Center for the Future of Places at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. I can't pronounce the Swedish there. He holds a PhD in architecture from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands.
Well, thank you, Phil. So I love what you were saying about social networks and about the Ostrom's work, because I'm going to pick up on that. And I'm, as you mentioned briefly, Phil, I'm working these days at KTH University in Stockholm at the Center for the Future of Places. And we're very interested in these issues of, how does the built environment support or alternatively frustrate human connectivity? And what we're learning is how incredibly important that is and how incredibly wrong we sometimes get it, and what it's going to take for us to change our ways and do a better job of it. And so that's really what I want to talk about in this talk. So looking at the current situation with the vaccines that are online, we're all really, I'm sure, encouraged by the good news. But at the same time, I think we recognize that there's a lot of disturbing news that reveals our underlying problems that this pandemic has shown to us. Obviously, retail employees are very, very hard hit. The poor, ethnic communities, the elderly, many parts of society, the divisions of society are being revealed in a profound way. And I think we recognize that we've got to do a better job. And when it comes to the elderly, as you're describing, Phil, the pandemic has been especially devastating, partly just because of the mortality rate. Around 13.4% of those over 80 and older are killed by the virus, much lower rates for younger populations, of course. Not only that, the pandemic enforces this social isolation that you were describing, and that often leads to, as you were alluding to, Phil, deteriorating mental and physical health, depression, decreases in cognitive functioning, and many other problems as well. So very, very hard impact on the elderly. And then also, I think the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of the problems we have with our encapsulated lifestyles and our car-dependent lifestyles in particular, which again are especially hard on the most vulnerable among us, including those who cannot drive for whatever reason, the poor, the infirm, and once again, the elderly. And they can't get the access to resources and to social contact that the automobiles can, to some degree at least, provide. And so we're recognizing that this is preventing not only seniors, but as you said, Phil, young people and others from forming these critical social connections that happen within the public spaces of our cities and towns and suburbs and the adjoining third places. And I want to dig down a little bit further and talk about that in a little bit more detail. And I want to point out that, again, these are serious structural challenges that we have to address through policy, but also through changes in the strategies and tools that we use for planning and design. So I'm going to try to end on a more concrete note about what can we do about it? What kinds of specific changes can we make? Also, in particular, focusing on public spaces, as I alluded to earlier, because research is demonstrating that these public spaces of our cities and towns and suburbs are an essential framework for accessing the resources and opportunities for forming social contacts, for knowledge exchange, and for healthy and ecological living. As my friend Joan Close puts it, without public space, you maybe don't have a city at all. You just have people in capsules trying to relate to one another and perhaps not doing it very well. And research is also showing the importance of public space for urban resilience. Some of you may know the work of Eric Kleinenberg, the sociologist who looked at the impact of the Chicago heat wave in 1995. And he found that neighborhoods that had sidewalks and stores and restaurants and community organizations that brought people into contact with friends and neighbors had a much higher survival rate than those neighborhoods that were more fragmented and where people were more isolated and didn't have those connectivities in the public realm, what he calls social infrastructure, which occurs critically in the public realm. So I think we're drawing some lessons from this period, this teachable moment, if you will. And I want to share with you a couple of those. One of them is this idea that public space really matters. I think we're all recognizing that we miss it in this period. We recognize how important it is when we don't have it and why it's really important. We have an emotional sense of that, and now we're beginning to have good evidence for that as well. The other point is that density is getting a bad name in the pandemic, but that's really not an accurate way of looking at it. It's not density, but rather the pattern of connectivity. And to illustrate that, I'll show you these three building types. This is exactly the same density in each case. The sort of towers in the park, the upper left, the row houses in the middle, and the perimeter block in the lower right. But what's different is the pattern of connectivity. And you'll notice that people can still connect with other people in the public realm, in the row houses or in the perimeter block, but they're not forced into these very tight adjacencies as they are in the elevators and the lobbies and the entranceways of the tall building, for example. And they're able to sort of keep social distance from one another and yet still interact in the public realm, all in the same density in each of those three cases. So I think that's an important lesson for us to draw. Let's not blame density for this pandemic. Let's blame the patterns of connectivity that matter more. And furthermore, I think we can have what I'd like to call sociable distancing, where you're still able to visit with people safely. This happens to be my daughter and grandkids. They're nice wraparound ports that they have that still allows them to connect with neighbors and yet to be safe and to practice social distancing and safety as well. Because let's remember that public space needs to protect us as well as to connect us. We need to be safe and protected from vehicles and from unsafe activities, crime and so on, and safe from pandemics and viruses and other things. It needs to exclude us as well as to include us. It needs to do that at a variety of scales, beginning at the human scale and really building out from there. The human scale is so fundamental in all of these things. And yet, if you think about what we're building in our time, so much of it is this kind of thing, right? It's not a healthy public realm where people are going to interact with one another and be able to form these social ties. It's much more fragmented. I love this photo. This is the kind of stuff we're doing too often when we're misaligning, we're failing to connect, we're creating fragmented cities. And sometimes what we think is rational, when we're doing it in a sort of fragmented way, you put it together and it becomes highly irrational. So you're in the unwalkable neighborhood, but you want to walk the dog. What do? You maybe drive the dog, or you want to go to the gym to do some exercise, and the only place to do that is in the mall. And the next thing you know, you're taking the escalator to use the Stairmaster. So these are funny examples, but it's a serious point that things that seem rational in isolation, when you put them together into an urban system, become highly irrational. And we're building a world that's unfortunately too much like that. And this matters especially right now because we are now on track to build more urban fabric around the world than we have in the last 5,000 years, which is a staggering fact. And so much of it is unfortunately fragmented and car dependent and sprawling, and it does not support good public realm, does not support equitable access and opportunity and social interaction and so on, and is more of this kind of place where you don't have the ability, you don't have the choice to walk or to bike. You are really constrained to be in your car and probably to drive through and to use the sort of drive-through lifestyle that's a high consumption lifestyle in this environment. On the left, this is San Antonio, the Loop 410 near the airport, if you know that. And this is Amsterdam on the right. And of course, your choices in Amsterdam are very, very different. You can ride at the bike, you can walk, you can shop at different places that are more perhaps healthier food and so on and so forth. So it's an interlocking system of choices that our urban environments offer to us. And this is a different way of thinking of cities that I think is the way we need to think about cities. As my friend Mike Batty puts it, as a set of interactions and flows and the kinds of networks that Phil was alluding to before that allow people to connect and to be creative and to thrive and to grow. And this goes back, of course, to the great Jane Jacobs and her description of the kind of problem a city is, a problem of organized complexity, as she referred to it, that does have a lot of intricately interconnected relationships, that sort of tissue of people and spaces that are all interconnected with one another, and especially right down to the lowly, unpurposeful, and random sidewalk, as she put it. And again, the human scale that is so fundamental to everything else. And that is the sort of small change, as she put it, from which a city's wealth of public life may grow, and other forms of literal wealth as well, as it turns out, as we're learning now. So we need to put this sort of theory of city form on the table, a theory of good city form, as Kevin Lynch put it, in order to examine it critically to say, are we really understanding, are we really serving human beings best with the way we're building cities today? Or are we more like the medieval plague doctors with their potions and bloodletting and other pseudosciences? And Jacobs was very critical of the planning of her day and a pseudo-scientific approach, almost neurotic in its determination to imitate empiric failure and ignore empiric success. And how much have we advanced since then? Well, some, but I would argue not enough. So I think we need to apply the lessons from the sciences that are emerging now, from network science, again, as Phil alluded to, that we're seeing in many fields in ecology and the work that the Ostroms have done and others. Lessons from anthropology and sociology, the great Holly White, William H. White, looking at how people interact in public spaces. Lessons from mathematics and game theory, how people form patterns of interconnection and activity and creation. Lessons from evolutionary morphology. How do cities grow and transform and improve often over time? Lessons from cognitive and environmental and social psychology. What kinds of environments are most conducive to our well-being, to our social interaction and social capital and so on? And going back to the network theory idea again, I think it's so fundamental to everything that we're dealing with in our challenges. And the fundamental point about the connective relationships that we have in our cities. We have very sort of fragmented tree-like patterns, the pattern on the left for our streets, for example, and many other aspects of our cities, as opposed to a more interconnected web-like pattern that you see on the right. And this has been described by a number of theoretical people, the great Herbert Simon, who talked about the architecture of complexity, and he talked about nearly decomposable hierarchies, not perfectly neat and organized, but nearly decomposable. Christopher Alexander, a few years later, wrote a great paper called A City is Not a Tree, where again, he noted that what's really critical is these interconnections, these what he called overlap or semi-lattices that are the sort of tissue that allow more things to happen and that are very, very important, it turns out, in urban relationships, these web network relationships that he later called patterns and developed a whole set of ideas around that. And Bruno Latour, actor network theory, the idea that we are in a web of relationships, not only with other people, but with other actors, which can be physical things, that can be animals or places. And this is a very important thing to understand. For example, you all know what happens when you come into a park and say you have a pet or somebody else has a pet, and you can focus on that pet as a sort of third actor and say, oh, that's a Malamute or whatever it is. You can start having a conversation with this person that you wouldn't have otherwise. It would be inappropriate. But because there's this third thing there, you're able to begin a conversation and begin a relationship. Similarly, in the case of a third place, Ray Oldenburg talked about the third places where you go in and you see a friend of yours and they say, here's another friend that I have, you guys haven't met. But so you start to form these connections between different things, these overlapping relationships, these web-like relationships that happen in public spaces and in the adjoining private spaces as well. And we're learning a lot about these patterns and how they form and how certain clusters of patterns are really important, what they call rich club networks, where you have concentrations of, let's say, talent or expertise, and that can be important. That's a real benefit. Clustering people in cities, called agglomeration benefits, those are also very real phenomena. Again, agglomeration is not just something that you want to do more and more and more. If a little is good, a lot is not always better. If 2 aspirins are twice as good as 1 aspirin, it doesn't follow that 100 aspirins are 100 times better, right? So there's a Goldilocks principle here, as there are in many things. There's a point where you have the sweet spot and you want to sort of spread it around and get, it's not just agglomeration benefits, but from the polycentric network. Remember, Ostrom's were talking about polycentric networks, and we can talk about polycentric cities and regions and nations. It's not just about the white hot core, the elite urban cores, and the other areas that become very unhappy, the left behind places, as it were, that begin to have an understandable, in this light, populist revolt towards the elite cores that are much more expensive and much more isolated. Agglomeration is a good thing, but we've got to spread it around, because there's a principle also in network theory which says that the more nodes you have in the network, the more powerful the network is. That's called Metcalfe's law. It's not just about the rich club network, it's about the whole network, the whole system. So what that means, among other things, is that having everyone connected into the city network or the region network is not just a matter of social justice, including the poor and the excluded and the people who are more marginalized. You want them to be connected because it's good for everybody's bottom line, ultimately. Not only because you have less policing and less crime and other drags on the economy, but because they're contributing. They're actually helping the entire network to function more optimally. And that's a very, very important idea, I think, when we're thinking about many of our problems in urban areas today. You know, Richard Florida is one of the people who talked about the creative class, right? And that's a very important idea, I think. But he also recognized that perhaps I got it wrong, that this is the only thing that matters. There may be a dark side to this. And Ed Glazer, who wrote The Triumph of the Cities, also said, well, let me agree that we're facing something of a crisis. Maybe we went too far with this idea that it's all about the dense cores of cities and that's all that matters. So we need what I would call a Goldilocks urbanism. Yes, the dense cores are important, but so are the polycentric nodes all over the network. And we need to be diverse, not only diverse in populations and diverse in use and diverse in activity, but diverse geographically as well. And that's a very important point. A related point is the idea that anytime you're increasing wealth, that's gentrification and that's bad. And that is not true. If you remember the Goldilocks principle, right? As Jane Jacobs pointed out, what you really want is neither a slum, a poor area where there's no opportunity and a lot of hardship, or a wealth enclave where there's no diversity and it becomes a slowly self-destructing diversity. What you want is that diversity optimum, the combination of maximum diversity and optimum wealth. And I call this the Jacobs curve. And what we need to do is use tools to avoid it tipping over into the self-destruction of diversity, and at the same time making sure that we're pushing up from the slum condition and what Jacobs called unslumming, and maintaining that optimum diversity, that Goldilocks zone, if you will. And this is very much along the lines of what Jacobs referred to when she described the kind of problem a city is. The kind of organized complexity that Jacobs described. So I know that's fairly abstract. So let me drill down into a more concrete version of how we structure our places. And I'll do that by giving you an example from where I used to live, the neighborhood that I lived in London. And this is right around the corner from my little flat there. And it's a fairly typical high street in London. What you'll notice is that there are a lot of different places where people can be indoors and outdoors, in the public realm, in the private realm, in the semi-public balconies and so on, and a lot of places that are connected to each other through movement, through sight, and through sound, and sometimes through sight, but not sound if it's through the glass, or sound but not sight if it's through the bushes. And this network of connections is incredibly complex, incredibly rich tissue, if you will, of web-like connections between these room-like spaces, as I call it, a place network. And if you think of it as literal rooms in a house, from the most private, your bedroom and so on, with walls and doors and windows and so on, to maybe your more semi-public realm, and maybe your even public realm, the porch out in the front and your yard, and then actually the space out on the street in front of your house and so on. All of these are room-like spaces. They all tend to have boundaries. They all tend to have gateways that can be controlled to some degree, or that people know when they're entering that they're transitioning into a zone that you have more control over, if they're walking up your steps or onto your porch or whatever. And again, this is a place network that we all have, and it can be defined by literal walls, or by vegetation, or by gates, or by pavement changes, or other things. And if you begin to see the world this way, you really begin to see this rich tapestry that's around us all the time, and that allows us to be more connected to one another, not less connected, because we're able to stay within this network and navigate our place in it. And this structure is transforming all the time. I went back to this neighborhood after 5 years, and you see in the lower picture, not only there's some new businesses, but also there's some new boundaries that people have created. They put fences across the terraces up on the top, and they put a couple of planters to mark the entrance to the doorway there. They took away the sidewalk cafe, maybe because of the time of year, I don't know, but it's transforming over time. People are making small incremental changes, and the structure, this place network, is self-organizing, and that's over 5 years. And what you can see in many cities around the world, many of the greatest cities, is even more transformation over longer periods of time, like the case of Venice over 100 years or so. If you look at the original cadastral plans of Venice, they're quite boring, actually. They just look like a American subdivision or something. But if you see how they were transformed over time as people began to build out and made changes to their boundaries and made modifications and incremental changes to these place networks, and got permission from the Doge or whatever to make these transformations, it got richer and richer and more beautiful, and gradually became the place that we know and love today, that is so fantastic and so complex. And this is the way that these cities are growing these web networks that allow us to be in the public realm and in the adjacent private realms in such marvelous self-organizing ways. And again, it happens in cities all over the world. This happens to be an informal settlement in South America. And what you'll see is there's a main street, and there's retail, and there's all these patterns that have self-organized there, like an Italian hill town, or like settlements all over the world, really. So this is a capacity that we need to recognize and embrace and understand and support. And yes, we're going to do top-down planning too, but we need to understand how this bottom-up self-organization is happening and be able to support that. When you look at the way that cities organize in this way with these, what I call place networks, you'll begin to see these patterns all over the place, and they're just marvelous. So this is in Pisa, Italy, many places in Italy that have these room-like spaces that are interrelated in this complex way, but also in the United States. This is near where I used to live in Portland on 23rd Avenue. And again, you'll see these very articulated little spaces that people can be and move and see and relate to one another. Here's another one all over the world. You'll see many, many places that have these characteristics. Unfortunately, here's what we're doing, though, in our modern planning. Here's Italy in 1910 or 1920, thereabouts. Here's Italy today, or 10 years ago, a new project. And no place networks, no tissue between the public and the private, just the private is bang on to the public realm. And you can see this was just finished, but this is just a lawn, and you can see how it would be once it's occupied. But it's a very sterile kind of place, I think you would agree. And here's Oslo in 1910, beautiful, lively street scene. Here's Oslo in 2010. Again, the private realm is bang up onto the public realm, which is a very deadly place, and the pedestrian experience leaves a lot to be desired. I think you would agree. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about what's happening in cities and why they're great places that mitigate our loneliness and that create a fabric of connections for us and the ways that that happens. But how do we actually implement those? And I'll describe briefly some ideas about that. And before I do, I want to back up and ask the question, when we're talking about urban growth, what are we talking about? Many people think we're talking about something terrible, right? It's like, whatever it is, it's going to be terrible and I'm against it. And they're not necessarily wrong, because so much of what we do build is this kind of thing. So I think NIMBYs often have a reason to be NIMBYs. And after all, they're citizens in a democracy and they have the right to say what happens to their public realm, just like everybody else who is a citizen does. And I think they have a reason sometimes to be alarmed about that, about degrading their quality of life. But on the other hand, this is a kind of growth too, right? This is a transformation and an enrichment and a process that goes on for thousands or millions of years and is sustainable. And this is growth too, right? There's Venice again, transforming and growing over time. And a similar kind of transformation is happening that makes a very high quality space that is also very durable and in that sense, sustainable, much more so than what we're doing today. Now, from a biological point of view, if we look at how this kind of growth happens, it's a stepwise growth according to rules and processes, genetic algorithms and chemical controls and stepwise transformations and so on. And this is a stepwise growth according to rules and processes, a stepwise crafting of the spaces, local rules, getting permission from the Doge and so on, traditional patterns and adaptive activities and so on and so forth. And this is stepwise growth according to rules and processes. In this case, it's segregated use zoning and remote design processes and bank lending rules and traffic engineering and so on and so forth. These are all generative systems or operating systems for growth, if you will. But they have different rules and different outcomes. And so we need to recognize if we want to create a different kind of growth, we need to use different kinds of generative processes and generative rules to do that. So we need to find the tools and strategies and processes that will actually generate that kind of quality. We need to change the operating system for growth. And Jane Jacobs talked about this idea also in Death and Life and later on in The Nature of Economies, and the idea that we have to think about a more organic process of growth. And yes, we support it with structural tools, but we're dealing with a different kind of problem, a problem a lot like gardening in a way. We find and we build fertile soil, we plant good genetic seeds, water and fertilize, prune and weed, build trellises and planter boxes and irrigation systems. And in the same way, in the city, we diagnose and improve the conditions of the city. We use patterns and prototypes. We use incentives and funding. We use regulations. And we do, yes, build infrastructure and frameworks and top-down processes that support the bottom-up processes. And all of those combined into, if you like, strategic toolkits that allow us to, in effect, be gardeners of the city, allowing that growth to happen. And what are those tools? Well, we all know them because many of us are working with reforms, even as citizens or as practitioners or in whatever. We're reforming zoning codes. We're changing them from use-based codes to form-based codes. We're changing standards like traffic engineering standards, financial mechanisms. We're finding new economic mechanisms to value the externalities, to create tax increment financing, for example, and private mechanisms, various kinds of bonds that are coming out now, enabling legislations, credits, incentives, strategic alignments between the silos that are sometimes doing these irrational things, as I alluded to earlier, and getting them into more of alignment with one another, more rational outcomes, incentives of various kinds, funding, and so on, low-tech solutions, tactical urbanism, and so on, better block strategy, and so on, and various kinds of strategic toolkits and combinations of toolkits and various kinds of collaborative tools so that we learn from each other. And this is where I'll go back to the point that Phil made about the conference this summer that we're doing in Carmel, Indiana, where we're going to be peer-to-peer sharing these kinds of tools. What did you do? How did that work out? And I'd like to try that too. One of the things we've just recently done is this new pattern language and a companion wiki, which you can go onto and play with if you'd like to, npl.wiki. And it includes many of these kinds of tools that I've just been describing for areas that are growing and that need these kinds of interventions and these kinds of strategic tools, and people who can maybe share these tools and modify them for local use and for the pandemic. So for example, how do you do a parklet that allows safe dining? How do you do sociable distancing, as I referred to it before, and what are the requirements to make sure that happens? And so again, I'll close with this note about the conference in Carmel, June 8th to 12th. You can go on to livable-cities.org, and some great people there. You probably know many of these people. Ellen Dunham Jones, who's done a lot of work on suburban retrofit, Elizabeth Platter-Zyberg, Chris Leinberger, Laura Petrella from UN Habitat, Dick Jackson, George Ferguson, Sven van Ungern Spernberg from Freiburg, Germany, and last but not least, our host, Jim Brainerd, who is the mayor in Carmel, and they are doing a fantastic job there with tons and tons of lessons to share all of the marvelous things they're accomplishing, and they'll share with us some of the things that didn't work as well as the things that did work. And we are all hoping, of course, that by then the vaccine will be largely behind us. In any case, we have a big, beautiful space that will allow for social distancing and lots of sociable distancing as well. So on that note, I hope we have a little bit of time for some discussion.
We certainly do. And thank you, Michael, for such a really excellent, wonderful, and comprehensive overview, given the short time that we have. And we've had a couple of questions. One of the interesting questions had to do with nature in the city. The fellow Roy Ernest used the phrase nature deficit disorder. And,
Right.
I often see the developers promoting green space within their development, but it's usually the residue left over from what they don't build on.
Right.
And so it's not really intentional in that sense. And I'm wondering, you showed some vegetation in one of the photos that you showed, but what are your thoughts about nature in the city?
I think it's hugely important, and I think the research is showing that very clearly. The phenomenon known as biophilia, and the amazing research evidence about things like recovery from surgery, going back to Roger Ulrich's great study, and other strong evidence for that. What I will say, though, is it's not just the vegetation, it's the geometries, the patterns. For example, the fractal patterns of the vegetation, and we're doing some work right now looking at some of those characteristics. You may remember the photo I showed that actually was the British Museum, and they had some vegetation in front of it. But the columns of the British Museum have actually acanthus leaves on them. So the idea that you're incorporating nature not only in a park or park-like environment, but into the buildings themselves, the geometries of nature and water and sunlight and living walls, but more than that, also the fractal patterns and the ornamentation and so on. And for example, this is turning out to be really important in hospital design, in creating a more calming, restorative kind of environment for patients. And now we're extending that out into the public realm and learning some lessons from that as well. Very important point.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have a question. It's on behalf of Matt Kaplan, who's one of our participants. And I've personally always been inspired by Alexander's design principle, old people everywhere.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, kids everywhere would also be a good design principle, it seems to me. And I was in Decatur, Georgia a few years ago, and it's a great little town with a nice town square. And about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the square is totally overwhelmed by kids coming out of school. And as an older person, I enjoyed sitting on the margin and watching all this. But in some ways, it's a multi-generational environment rather than an intergenerational environment. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But the question is, how can spaces not only be multi-generational, but intergenerational and attract children and elders into interaction with one another.
Right, right. So I think that's hugely important. And of course, when Alexander said old people everywhere, he didn't mean just old people. He meant a mix, right? And
Mhm.
I think of older populations and very young populations as a kind of indicator species. If they can be there, if they want to be there, it's probably a pretty good space, and probably lots of other people are there too. But it goes back to what I said before about the actor network theory and the idea that sometimes a third thing, a third actor, can be the catalyst that connects people that wouldn't otherwise be connected. In in Portland, I see Carolyn McGrath, who's from Portland, would probably know this space in Jameson Square in the Pearl District. There's a water fountain that all the kids love to run and play in. And then there's benches around that area. And a lot of the empty nesters who live in that area come out and sit in front of those benches, and often a conversation will start between the parents of the kids and a person who's sitting there watching the kids, uh, and oh, is that your daughter? I have a granddaughter just that age, and whatever. And so the third actor creates a connection, and I think that's very, very important to think of it that way when you're thinking of, creating a fountain or creating a sculpture or a conversation piece, so to speak, or a
Mhm.
dog park where the dogs or the pets are the third actors in creating these connections.
Love it. Can you discuss the role of co-design in creating environments that reduce social isolation? This is something that, as you know, emerged in Northern Europe in the 1970s with the collective resource approach to workplace systems, where workers were empowered to design their own workplaces. And I'm wondering if that has carried over to your work in Stockholm. How does environmental design in Stockholm differ from that in the US, and what are the lessons for us? And how do they approach issues around the life course?
So I wouldn't say that Stockholm is without its own mistakes. They built a lot of sort of towers in the park after the war and kind of went crazy with that. And now they're having problems with those are often immigrant communities, and they have uh, problems with isolation there as well, and lack of opportunity and other things. But clearly, there are some advantages that European countries have in terms of having a good fabric to start with, and many more, probably more appreciation of the importance of that fabric. And I think the idea of co-design, especially, is something that is caught on there, not only because you want the people who are going to live there to play a role, but and this is something that's often misunderstood. People say, well, but they're going to leave and somebody else is going to live there. If the building is at all sustainable, it's going to be there for 300-400 years. And that's absolutely true. The point is, the person who's doing the co-design is reminding the professional of what a human being actually cares about. They're the kind of stand-in, if you will, for all the other people that might occupy that space in the future. And they're bringing the human factor, the user factor, into the process to make the process more adaptive to real human needs, and not just to the designer's abstractions and construals about human need. And that's a really important principle, I think, in design. And yeah, I think Europe is, in some ways, Europe is ahead of the United States, but in some ways, the United States is ahead of Europe in some of our financial mechanisms and other things. And that's part of what the IMCL is focused on, as you know, Phil, is sharing those lessons. We alternate conferences between the US and Europe to allow exactly that kind of cross-fertilization.
Mhm. The issue of self-organization is an interesting one because that enables people to really inhabit the space. I mean, in a phenomenal bodily way, which I think gives it life and gives it meaning. And I think sometimes in formal planning, we overbuild, really look for perfection, when what we need to build in is imperfectness, maybe wabi sabi. And so
Yeah.
are there policies in planning that we can promote or incentives for allowing spaces to be self-organized by the people who inhabit them?
Well, I think it goes back to what you were saying about co-design, and also about keeping, it's a different way of thinking about design, as again, treating it more like gardening, like you're going to let the garden grow up on its own. You're going to create a framework or a trellis, if you will, and the stuff is going to happen along the way. And maybe you guide it, maybe you prune, maybe you water. You know, pruning might be a design code, right? Or it might be other things. So it's not about, well, it's all top down or it's all bottom up. It's how do you mesh those, right?
Mm.
I think that's the critical question.
Yeah, yeah. Fred Kent has argued that physical design doesn't work without programming. This is a similar kind of a question, really, or at least some attention to how we can animate places. And do you have examples of best practices that cities use to animate places?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, again, recognizing the value of your public spaces and creating the tools and the support structures to build on those, I think is the most fundamental thing of all. Hey, Phil, I'm very sorry. I'm going to have to leave you
That's
guys.
okay.
A hard meeting deadline at 4, but this has been delightful, and I'm so glad to have been able to be with you. And I hope to see many of you in June.
I have a ball, and please stay in touch with me if you need to around the conference. We've recorded it, so it'll be available. And I want to thank Michael for coming today. And it's been really fun and really interesting. So
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.